I'd like to talk about how to align the IEP to state standards, in particular California standards for us. This is one of the most difficult and sometimes misunderstood ideas about the work we do with students with moderate to severe disabilities. So this information is actually adapted from a textbook that I really liked called Aligning IEPs to State Standards for Students with Moderate to Severe Disabilities by our two doctor friends there. We know that the student's IEP is developed to meet the individual needs of our students and by nature is not standardized, but rather flexible. However, in 2015, in response to worries about the quality and access to general education curriculum, the United States Department of Education in IDEA clarified that an IEP for a child with a disability must be aligned with the state's academic content standards for the grade in which the student is enrolled. The worry was that teachers were underestimating students' abilities and not even giving them access to academic learning based on their lack of communication skills or other access issues, which would be discriminatory. In some of your observations, you may see that teachers are not still giving access to general education or aligning state standards. It takes time for things to change, and this is a relatively new change in 2015. Research, such as conducted by Allor, Matthews, Roberts, and Cheatham in 2010, demonstrated that children with disabilities who struggle in reading and mathematics can successfully learn grade-level content and make significant academic progress when the proper instruction, services, feedback, and supports are provided to them. Some students with disabilities are included in state and district assessments, many times with accommodations, while other students need alternative assessments because they can't participate in large-scale assessments even with accommodations. You'll need to know what kind of assessment your students will be utilizing. Alternative assessments have changed over time and continue to evolve, but provide students with opportunities to learn general education content in an ongoing priority. California has in fact developed some great alternative standards that you can utilize to access and see what they consider essential for each typical grade level standard. So the whole point of this is that students should have fair access to academic standards, and the IEP should be aligned to these. So we're going to take a look at how, in fact, you can do this. This graphic serves to give an example of how an IEP can be aligned with the state standard. We'll use Mrs. Smith's class as an example here. Ms. Smith is a special education teacher in a third grade class with students with moderate to severe disabilities. Her students participate in state alternative assessments. One portion of the assessment determines if the students can group items and count the set, which is a concrete form of multiplication. The only math skill Ms. Smith has targeted for her students' IEP is telling time. We can see in the next illustration that we would consider her IEP standards not aligned with the state standards. This figure demonstrates that while the multiplication standard is aligned with the state alternative assessment that the student's going to be taking, it is in fact not aligned with the IEP since the only skill addressed there was telling time. Take a look at another example which is more appropriately aligned. When planning for one of her students, John, Ms. Smith considers that he's struggling to combine sets because he only has limited use of one hand. He makes most of his responses through the use of an augmentative or alternative communication device, or through use of a switch that functions as a mouse for the computer. To master the concept of combining sets, John first needs to learn how to create and then count sets. Consequently, the IEP decides that one IEP goal for John will be to learn to identify numbers with his AAC device. For example, when the teacher says 9, John will locate the numeral 9 on his device. This goal provides broader access to numerous math activities in 3rd grade. In addition, an IEP goal will address counting with one-to-one correspondence in order to accurately form sets. This is a fundamental numeracy skill that will allow John access to higher-level math skills. The figure shows how his IEP promotes alignment of his instruction to the 3rd grade standards related to multiplication for mathematics. This figure demonstrates how John now has an aligned IEP goal. The 3rd grade standard, which is multiplication or combining sets, can be utilized in his IEP using his AAC device, which is a particular skill he has to develop, and counting in one-to-one correspondence, which helps him develop the capability to combine sets. So it is aligned with the multiplication standard as a prerequisite or foundational skill. It aligns the standard with his IEP and also John's practical and developmental ability at this current time. Let's take a look at another example, this time exploring alignment with high school curriculum. This can be particularly challenging when the gap between the general education curriculum and the student's academic skills is very large. In this example, we're going to take a look at a student whose name is Ramona, and she's in 9th grade, and she has a severe disability, and she currently has no reading skills, but who enjoys the social context of being with typically developing peers in English class. A standard for 10th grade English targets understanding symbolism and poetry and other literature. The IEP wants to build Ramona's social success by promoting some literacy skills that links to the poetry focus in the 10th grade. Since Ramona can use picture symbols for basic needs in social communication, the IEP team considers how she might learn the more abstract symbols of poetry. Similarly, the team considers the standards in other academic areas like math and science. Because of Ramona's age, the team wants to target on some life skills, like learning to follow picture word directions to complete a vocational task. While this state alternative standard only targets academic skills, Ramona's progress in learning life skills is also important for her transition planning. This shows how we're going to align the IEP with both the life skills and the general education curriculum. So she's in 10th grade. We're learning about symbolism. We can align that with an instructional purpose of aligning words to abstract symbols and related to poetry, but also related to some typical life skill, some typical life abstract and less abstract things that she will need for vocational skills. So we can still consider that to be aligned with the 10th grade academic standards. Now that you've seen a couple examples, let's sort of break down what we need to do in order to align the IEP to standards. First of all, we need to become familiar with the state standards and sort of unpack them. They're really wordy and long and filled with lots of concepts. So unpacking them just means to break them down into understandable language and understandable steps. Also, we want to become familiar with alternative achievement standards, which California does have for students who have moderate to severe disabilities. We'll be taking a look at those and exploring the website. This is a great way to sort of unpack and see, oh, this is kind of the core essential part of that standard, which is the next piece of this. And then thinking about those standards, we also have to keep in mind the individual student and who they are and what their abilities are. So let's take a look at another example at how to do this. Let's take a look at Camilla, who is in 7th grade. She's learning how to direct her own IEP meeting She uses an AAC device in order to greet and ask participants to introduce themselves. She's also involved in presenting how she's doing in class and her recent achievements. She uses an iPad and a graph she's created using a graphing app. The team then helps her to summarize her present levels of performance, and they want to take a look at some new goals for Camilla. Camilla is really interested in swimming. She'd like to have more times with friends and to use her computer more at school. The parents also really like that she's using an AAC device, but they don't want her to give up on teaching her to read. In reviewing both the science and math standards, the team realizes that Camilla doesn't have symbols in her AAC device in order to communicate some of the math and science concepts that she needs to. So they develop an IEP that focuses on increasing your comprehension and the use of 20 key words and symbols that correspond to those subjects. For both science and social studies, Camilla will need an alternative to paper-pencil activities that were frequently used by the class. The team determined that another access goal, one that would also relate to her preference for computers, would be to learn to select a picture from an array of pictures from her online textbook to express the key concepts. One of the specific math skills for her was to master this year revolved graphing. So they talked about how they could use a graphing program and how she might be able to graph some of her activities related to swimming. So it relates back to her particular interest. The team started thinking about 7th grade language arts and reading. They targeted that in order to keep her more fully engaged, that Camilla will be able to select pictures to identify the main idea, conflict, and resolution from a narrative text read to her by one of her friends. To keep working toward reading, they also decided to have her participate in a reading class that used a systematic phonics instruction. They also decided to use short summaries of novels from English class or information from social studies utilizing a software program. The teacher would begin with single words and short phrases and build toward reading passages. One thing to remember is that we don't have to fit all of the students' IEP goals back to standards. Sometimes they just don't fit. The student may have some individualized therapies or some particular needs that do not align with any academic standard, and that's completely fine.